10 prehistoric structures that should have been impossible to build. Number 10. The Ggantija temples. For centuries, the people of Gozo, the smaller island of the Maltese archipelago, had a simple explanation for the two enormous stone shells standing in their fields. A giant built them. A giantess, to be precise. A woman who lived on broad beans and honey, carried the stones on her head while nursing a child, and stacked them into walls no ordinary person could lift. The name they gave the place still carries that belief. Ggantija means, roughly, the Tower of the Giants. It is exactly the kind of story archaeologists are trained to set aside. But stand in front of the southern temple, look at the blocks, and the instinct behind the legend becomes easy to understand. Some of the upright slabs here exceed 5 meters in length and weigh more than 50 tons. They were raised around 3,600 years before the Common Era. That makes Ggantija older than the pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia. By the current evidence, these are the oldest freestanding buildings anywhere on the planet that are still standing. And the people who raised them had almost nothing we associate with monumental building. No metal, no wheel, no draft animal strong enough for the task. They quarried the hard, gray, coralline limestone for the outer walls, and the softer Globigerina limestone for the interiors. And they moved blocks the weight of a loaded truck across open ground using levers, packed earth, and, very probably, stone spheres as rollers. Hundreds of which have turned up at Maltese temple sites, worn smooth on one side. There is more here than weight. The temples were laid out in a cloverleaf plan, lobed chambers opening off a central corridor, built to a deliberate architectural idea rather than thrown up at random. The southern temple's entrance is aligned so that the rising sun touches its inner stones at the solstice. Ggantija is only one of more than 24 such temples across the tiny Maltese islands. And the same culture cut an entire underground necropolis out of solid rock, the hypogeum, chamber by chamber, with antler and stone. From that culture, excavators have also pulled a strange population of small statues. Heavy, faceless, broad-hipped figures that may represent a deity of fertility or death. Whoever these people were, they were not improvising. They had a religion, a style, and an architecture, and they expressed all three in stone too heavy to lift. They also built to be sheltered, not just to impress. The temple interiors held altars, hearths, and screened inner rooms, and were very likely roofed with timber and hide long since rotted away. Among the carved figures the same culture left behind is a small, corpulent statue so finely made that it has become an emblem of Neolithic Malta. A reminder that the hands hauling 50-ton blocks could also work stone at the scale of a closed fist. Here is where Ggantija stops being a story about engineering and becomes a story about organization. 50 tons can be coaxed across flat ground over a short distance with enough rope and enough shoulders. The harder question is who organized those shoulders. This was a small farming population on an island you can walk across in a day, with no king we can name, no army, no written word, no city. Something held them together tightly enough to quarry, drag, and raise stone on a scale that would not be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. And then the detail that should bother anyone who looks closely. The people who built the Maltese temples vanished. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, after roughly 1,000 years of temple building, the entire culture collapsed. The sites fell silent. Whether the cause was soil exhaustion, drought, isolation, or some combination no core sample has yet resolved, the builders left no successors and no explanation. They raised the oldest standing architecture on Earth, and then they were gone. Ggantija sits at the gentle end of impossibility. Heavy stone, moved a short way by people we cannot fully account for. But somewhere on this countdown, ambition runs into a wall that no length of rope can climb. In a quarry in eastern China, that wall is still standing, half cut, exactly where the workers walked away from it. Number 9. The Yangshan Quarry. Most of the entries on this list are mysteries because we do not know who built them, or when, or how. This one is the opposite, and that is precisely why it matters.
We know exactly who ordered it, exactly when, and exactly why it was never finished. Yangshan is the control experiment, the moment a civilization with almost unlimited resources tried to cut the largest monument in human history, and the rock simply said no. In the year 1405, the Yongle Emperor of China's Ming Dynasty ordered a colossal stele, a single commemorative tablet, to honor his late father, to be carved from the limestone hills near Nanjing. His stonecutters set to work on 3 pieces: a base, the tall body, and a crown. They tunneled under and around each piece to free it from the bedrock, and you can still walk those gaps today. The base alone measures roughly 30 meters long and 16 meters tall, and weighs an estimated 16,000 tons. The body would have stood close to 50 meters and weighed nearly 9,000 tons. The crown adds another 6,000.
Assembled, the finished stele would have risen more than 70 meters, the height of a 20-story building, carved from single pieces of living stone. The workers cut all 3 nearly free. The chisel marks are still there. And then someone at court did the arithmetic. To move the base, 16,000 tons, across the countryside to the imperial mausoleum, and then to stand the body upright on top of it, was not difficult. It was not merely expensive, it was impossible, and the engineers knew it. The planners had ambition the size of a mountain. The mountain, as it turned out, weighed more. To grasp the gap, set it against the rest of this list. The base alone outweighs the entire basalt city we are about to reach in the Pacific, and it is more than 10 times the mass of the largest single stone the Egyptians ever cut. The Yongle Emperor was not a man accustomed to limits. He sent vast treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean and moved the capital of China north to build Beijing. But a stone is not a fleet. Tonnage does not take orders, and at 16,000 tons, the command quietly went unfulfilled. There is a reason the Yongle Emperor wanted something this large. He had taken the throne from his own nephew in a civil war, and a monument of staggering size to his father was, among other things, a claim to legitimacy carved in stone. Ambition on that scale is rarely only about engineering. The stone, however, cared about politics even less than it cared about emperors, so they left it. Today, the half-born stele is a public park, and visitors walk up and lay a hand flat against a stone that was meant to outlast every empire, and instead became a monument to the exact point where human strength runs out. Yangshan marks the ceiling.
Somewhere above roughly 1,000 tons, with muscle, rope, and even iron tools, transport stops being an engineering problem and becomes a fantasy, which is what makes the next site genuinely hard to explain, because the people who built it had no iron, no written mathematics, no continent of labor to draw on. They had canoes. And they moved an estimated 750,000 tons of stone out into the sea. Number 8. Nan Madol. Off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, a small volcanic island in the western Pacific, there is a city that should not exist. It does not sit on the island. It sits in the water beside it. Nearly 100 artificial islets laid out across a shallow reef lagoon, separated and connected by a grid of tidal canals. Travelers who reached it called it the Venice of the Pacific. The name the builders used, Nan Madol, means something closer to the spaces between, a reference to the channels that thread the whole complex together.
The walls are the staggering part. They are built from columns of basalt, long, naturally faceted prisms, 5, 6, sometimes 8 sides, formed when thick lava cools slowly underground. The builders stacked these like enormous timber, log cabin style, crossing them at the corners. Individual columns run from a few tons to as much as 50. The total mass of basalt moved to raise the city has been estimated at around 750,000 tons, which, spread across the roughly 4 centuries of construction, means moving close to 2,000 tons of stone every year by hand, on an island with no metal, no wheels, and no draft animals.
The chronology was long vague until archaeologist Mark McCoy and his colleagues used uranium-thorium dating on coral built into the tombs to pin the monumental phase to a narrow window. the megalithic city rising between roughly the years 1180 and 1200 under the Saudeleur dynasty, the first rulers to bind the whole island under a single authority from this island capital. The basalt did not come from the lagoon. It was quarried from outcrops elsewhere on Pohnpei, which means every column had to be brought to the site across water. The conventional answer is rafts, columns lashed beneath or between canoes and floated on the tide. It is almost certainly correct for the smaller stones, but the largest columns weigh more than any reconstructed raft has reliably carried, and no modern experiment has convincingly floated a 50-ton basalt log to a reef and lifted it into a wall. That gap is the honest, open question at Nan Madol. We know the method in outline. We have never quite reproduced it at full scale. The Pohnpeians had their own account, and it is worth hearing before dismissing it. Two sorcerers, the brothers Olosopa and Olosipa, were said to have flown the stones through the air with a spell. Strip away the magic and a memory remains, that the stones came from elsewhere, that moving them was beyond ordinary means, and that the feat was extraordinary enough to be remembered as sorcery. The grandest islet, the royal mortuary called Nandawas, is ringed by walls that rise in places close to 8 meters, built from basalt logs stacked end-on and lengthwise like brickwork the size of fallen trees. What lingers is the choice of ground. This was not a fortress on a hill. The builders picked the most exposed place imaginable, a reef at the edge of the open Pacific, with no fresh water and no soil, and filled it islet by islet with crushed coral until they had dry foundations for the dead and the powerful. To live there was a statement of control over nature itself. The same ocean that carried the stone now erodes the walls. Rising seas and storms are slowly reclaiming the canals, which means the engineering marvel and the thing most likely to dismantle it are one and the same. The dynasty that built it did not last. Pohnpeian tradition holds that a warrior named Isokelekel overthrew the final Saudeleur ruler, and over the following centuries, the stone city was gradually abandoned to the tide. Today, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and one listed as in danger, undercut by mangroves, battered by storms, exposed to the same rising water closing in on every low Pacific shore. The city, built to project power over the ocean, is now being quietly repossessed by it. Nan Madol's builders fought the ocean. The next builders fought a mountain and a river running directly between them and the stone they wanted. Number 7. Ollantaytambo. In the sacred valley of Peru, on a steep terrace above the town of Ollantaytambo, stands an unfinished wall. 6 monoliths of pink-red porphyry, a hard volcanic rock, set upright in a row, each one over 50 tons, fitted edge to edge with thin spacer stones slotted between them. It is called the Wall of the 6 Monoliths, and it was meant to be the front of a great sun temple that the builders never completed. The wall is impressive on its own. The route the stones traveled to reach it is what stops you. The quarry, a site called Kachikata, is not nearby. It lies across the valley, across the Urubamba River, about 6 kilometers away and several hundred meters higher up the opposite mountainside. So the path each stone took was not a gentle drag across a field. It went down one mountain, across a flowing river, and up the other side to the temple terrace. The Inca cut ramps, laid long stone slides, and, in places, appeared to have rerouted the river channel itself to get the blocks across. Parts of that ramp are still visible from the valley floor, a pale scar running up the mountainside. And they did not finish. The evidence is lying in plain sight along the haul road. Scattered between the quarry and the temple are the piedras cansadas, the tired stones, enormous blocks abandoned mid-journey, stopped wherever the effort failed and never moved again. You can still walk the ancient road and find them, a single-shaped stone the size of a delivery truck, resting halfway up a hillside, pointed at a temple it never reached. Look closely at the 6 monoliths that did arrive, and a second kind of skill appears. Their faces are dressed nearly flat, the seams packed with thin slivers of stone, and several still carry small stone bosses, deliberate knobs left protruding, that the builders used as handholds and leverage points, and simply never ground away. The wall faces directly across the valley toward the quarry it came from, as if the finished temple was meant to look back at the mountain it had been torn out of. The town below the terraces is itself a piece of Inca engineering still in daily use, laid out on the original grid, its streets and water channels running exactly where the empire put them, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the Americas. The mainstream explanation for the abandonment is not mysterious. The Spanish conquest arrived, the empire that organized this labor fractured, the workforce dispersed, and the Sun Temple was frozen exactly as it stood, 6 monoliths up, the rest of the wall still scattered across the valley as tired stone. What Ollantaytambo preserves, better than any finished monument could, is the process itself, the ramps, the route, the stones caught in the act of being moved. And it has one thing the finished temples lack: a battle fought on its terraces. In 1537, the Inca leader Manco Inca made a stand here against a Spanish cavalry force led by Hernando Pizarro, raining arrows and stones from the same steep platforms the masons had built, and flooding the plain below to mire the horses. He won, one of the few open Inca victories of the conquest. The men defending those terraces were standing on an unfinished monument, using the engineering of their grandfathers as a fortress. The temple never received its god, but it sheltered the people who built it one last time. 6 kilometers and 1 river is a serious haul.
It is almost nothing next to the distance a group of Neolithic Britons appear to have dragged their stones. A journey that, according to research published in 2024, may have crossed nearly the entire length of an island. Number 6. Stonehenge. Everyone knows the silhouette. The ring of upright sarzens on Salisbury Plain, capped with stone lintels, standing against an English sky. And the sarzens are heavy, the largest around 25 tons, brought from Westwoods, roughly 25 kilometers to the north. That source was pinned down only in 2020, when a geochemist named David Nash matched the sarsen chemistry to that exact patch of Wiltshire downland, using a core that had been drilled from one of the stones in the 1950s and returned from a private collection more than 60 years later. The sarzens are a hard job, done by people who clearly knew how to do it. They are not the part that breaks the explanation.
The harder problem stands inside the sarsen ring, the blue stones. Smaller, darker, and geologically out of place on the chalk plain. And there are roughly 80 of them. For decades, the question was where they came from, and the answer turned out to be West Wales. Geologists Richard Bevans and Robert Ixer matched the bluestone chemistry to specific outcrops in the Preseli Hills, places like Craig Rosefellen, roughly 230 kilometers from Stonehenge. 230 kilometers for stones weighing a few tons each, moved by people with antler picks, timber, and rope, in a monument that was raised and rearranged in stages across roughly 500 years. Then 2024 rewrote the map again. The altar stone, the largest blue stone, a slab of sandstone weighing around 6 tons, lying flat at the very center of the monument, had always been assumed Welsh like the rest.
A team led by Anthony Clark at Curtin University in Australia, publishing in the journal Nature, analyzed the ages of mineral grains locked inside it and found they did not match Wales at all. They matched the Orcadian Basin of northeast Scotland, more than 700 kilometers away. It is the longest distance stone transport known from anywhere in that era. This is where the genuine debate lives, and it is worth stating honestly. The mainstream view holds that people move the bluestones, over land, over water, by sheer organized effort. A minority of geologists, led by Brian John, have long argued that glaciers did the heavy lifting, carrying the stones partway before any human touched them. A separate 2024 study of a bluestone boulder at the site argued against the glacial idea, finding none of the ice scarring such a journey would leave. The two camps still disagree.
But what neither side disputes is the core fact. Stones from Wales, and at least one from Scotland, ended up arranged on a plain in southern England, carried there across distances that should have been beyond a Neolithic society and somehow were not. There was also the matter of who was standing on that plain. Isotope studies of bodies buried around Stonehenge show that some of the people there grew up far away, One man, the so-called Amesbury Archer, buried near the monument with the earliest gold yet found in Britain, spent his childhood somewhere in the region of the Alps. The site pulled both rock and human beings toward itself from the far edges of a world that supposedly could barely move either. And there is the question of what it was all for. The monument's main axis points to the midsummer sunrise in one direction and the midwinter sunset in the other, which makes Stonehenge, among other things, a vast stone calendar tuned to the turning of the year.
The archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson has argued it was also a place of the dead. One of the largest Neolithic cemeteries in Britain lies among its stones. A temple, a calendar, a graveyard. The categories blur because the people who built it did not sort the world the way we do. Stonehenge is, at most, around 5,000 years old. Remarkable by any measure. But the next site nearly doubles that age and strips farming, pottery, and the written word out of the toolkit entirely. Number 5. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, working with the German Archaeological Institute, walked onto a low, rounded hill in southeastern Turkey that earlier surveyors had dismissed as a medieval cemetery. He saw the tops of large limestone slabs breaking the surface and recognized them for what they were: the crowns of carved, monumental pillars. He spent the rest of his life excavating the site, until his death in 2014.
What he uncovered were rings of T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing more than 5 meters tall, the central ones weighing in the range of 10 to 16 tons, with at least one unfinished pillar still lying in its quarry that would have weighed an estimated 50 tons. The pillars are not blank slabs. They are stylized human figures. Arms carved in low relief running down their sides, hands brought together over the belly, belts and loincloths picked out in stone, surrounded by a bestiary of foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, and vultures. As monumental architecture, it is striking, but not by weight alone unbelievable. The impossibility at Göbekli Tepe is not the tonnage, it is the date. The oldest enclosures were raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era, roughly 11,500 years ago. That is before pottery, before metal, before the wheel, and, most disorienting of all, before farming. The people who quarried, carved, and raised these pillars were hunter-gatherers, foragers without villages, without agriculture, without any of the things the textbooks said you needed before you could organize labor on a monumental scale. For a century, the model of human history ran in one direction. First agriculture, then settled villages, then surplus, then the leisure and organization to build temples. Göbekli Tepe runs that sequence backward. Here, the monument appears to come first. Klaus Schmidt's own provocative reading was that the gathering place came before the settled town, that the need to build and feast together may have helped drive people toward farming rather than the other way around. The site is thick with the bones of wild game, the residue of enormous gatherings, and possibly of fermented drink, a place where hundreds came together, ate, and hauled stone. That interpretation is still argued over. More recent excavation suggests people may have lived there too, not merely worshipped. But the central fact holds. Foragers built this. And when they were done with each set of enclosures, for reasons no one has explained, they deliberately buried them under tons of rubble. One pillar has drawn more argument than all the rest. On the stone catalogued as Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, a great bird spreads its wings beside a scorpion and a headless human figure, carved with a care that says it meant something specific to the people who made it. A handful of researchers have read it as a record of some catastrophe in the sky. Most read it as ritual imagery, whose meaning is simply lost. Either way, it is symbolic thought worked into monumental stone 11,000 years deep by minds we are too quick to picture as purely practical. Nor is Göbekli Tepe alone. A dozen kilometers away, at a site called Karahan Tepe, excavators have since uncovered more enclosures, more T-shaped pillars, and a chamber lined with rows of carved stone pillars, and a human head emerging from the rock, part of a whole landscape of monumental sites the same culture raised across the region before farming took hold. Geophysical surveys suggest as many as 20 enclosures still lie under the hill at Göbekli Tepe, the great majority never excavated. Whatever else it is, the world's oldest monument is mostly still underground. Göbekli Tepe breaks our timeline for when humans could organize monumental labor. The next site breaks something else entirely: our assumptions about how finely Stone Age hands could shape hard rock. Number 4. Pumapunku.
High on the Bolivian Altiplano, at around 3,800 meters, where the air is thin and trees do not grow, lie the ruins of Tiwanaku, and within them, a wrecked platform called Pumapunku that has launched more bad theories than almost any site on Earth. The reason is the stonework. Scattered across the ground are the famous H blocks, andesite blocks cut into near-identical interlocking shapes with flat faces, true right angles, internal channels, and drill marks set out in straight lines, many of them so alike they look mass-produced. The scale underneath the precision is easy to miss. The largest single slab at Pumapunku, a sandstone platform stone, measures close to 8 meters long and weighs an estimated 130 tons. The sandstone was quarried roughly 10 kilometers away.
The finer andesite, the material of the H blocks, came from much further. Petrographic studies trace it to sources some 90 kilometers off, around or across Lake Titicaca. Radiocarbon dates from the deepest fill place the monumental construction after the year 536 of the Common Era. Not the impossibly ancient date that an early researcher, Arthur Poznański, once proposed from stargazing alignments, but firmly within the reach of a known Andean civilization. The precision is what people fixate on, and it has produced a popular claim that the blocks are too perfect for hand tools, that they must have been cast from some kind of artificial geopolymer, a sort of ancient concrete poured into molds. It is worth addressing directly because it sounds reasonable until you check it. Petrographic analysis shows the H blocks are natural andesite, with the crystal structure of solid igneous rock, not cast material.
The mainstream explanation is less magical and, if anything, more impressive. The Tiwanaku worked the stone by grinding and pounding, with harder hammerstones and sand abrasives, achieving flat faces and sharp interior angles through staggering patience rather than secret chemistry. One detail at Tiwanaku deserves more attention than it gets. In places, the builders bound their stones together with metal, pouring molten copper-arsenic-nickel alloy into double dovetail sockets carved across the joint between two blocks, so the cooling metal locked them like a cramp. Analysis of some of these clamps indicates the metal was cast in place on the stone in the open air, which means the Tiwanaku were running a portable smelting operation right beside their masonry. And to bring the andesite at all, they appear to have ferried multi-ton blocks across or around Lake Titicaca, the highest large navigable lake on Earth, on boats of bundled reed. What genuinely remains unexplained is not the perfection of any one block. It is the standardization. The H blocks were shaped to a shared template, interchangeable, as if meant to be slotted together in modular combinations. Why a society with no writing we can read mass-produced architectural components to a common specification, and what the finished structure was supposed to be, is a question the rubble has not answered. Tiwanaku declined around the year 1000, and its builders left no manual. Pumapunku shows precision without iron. The next Andean site shows precision at a scale that makes the blocks themselves hard to believe. Single stones heavier than a fueled airliner, fitted so tightly you cannot slide a blade into the seam. Number 3. Sacsayhuamán. Above the old Inca capital of Cusco, 3 great terraced walls run in a long zigzag along the hillside, and they are built from some of the largest worked stones ever set into a wall by human hands.
The biggest blocks at Sacsayhuamán are estimated to weigh between 100 and 200 tons. Single pieces of limestone and diorite, taller than a person, laid in irregular polygonal courses. There is no mortar. The blocks are cut with many-sided faces that lock against their neighbors, and the joints are famous for a reason. Across whole sections of wall, you cannot slip a knife blade, a sheet of paper, or a fingernail between the stones. The zigzag itself was no accident. The saw-toothed plan means any attacker approaching the wall exposes a flank to the terrace beside it. The Emperor Pachacuti, who remade Cusco in the 15th century, laid out the whole capital in the shape of a puma, with Sacsayhuamán as its head and teeth. 3 great towers once rose behind these walls, 1 round, 2 square, holding water, stores, and the quarters of the garrison. The Spanish pulled them down, and only their foundations remain.
But the terraces still fill every June when the festival of Inti Raymi, the Inca celebration of the sun at the winter solstice, is staged again on the open ground above the zigzag walls. How the Inca achieved that fit is no longer a deep mystery, and that is largely thanks to one researcher. Jean-Pierre Protzen, an architect at the University of California, Berkeley, spent years at the Inca quarries and reproduced the technique himself. He showed that the polygonal joints were made by pounding, striking the stone with harder hammerstones, fitting each block against the one already placed, lifting it, pecking down the high spots, and lowering it again, over and over, until the surfaces matched exactly. Levers, ramps, and packed earth embankments moved the blocks. The quarries lay several kilometers off. The method is human, repeatable, and understood. What patience cannot fully account for is the upper end of the weight range. Moving a 200-ton block across rough Andean terrain and seating it into a wall with that kind of precision is a feat of organization that strains belief, even when you know the toolkit. The chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, himself of Inca descent, wrote a century later of a single colossal stone, the Incas called it the Tired Stone, that thousands of men had been dragging toward Sacsayhuamán when it broke loose and crushed hundreds of them. The tale may be embroidered, but it carries the texture of the real cost. This kind of building was paid for in lives, and the walls earned that price. Polygonal masonry, locked at many angles with no mortar, behaves remarkably in an earthquake. The stones shift and resettle rather than topple, which is part of why these walls have outlasted 4 centuries of Andean tremors and the colonial city stacked on top of them. There is a grim footnote that captures the stones better than any statistic.
After the conquest, the Spanish quarried Cusco itself, pulling apart Inca walls to build churches and houses from the cut stone. They dismantled what they could carry. But the largest blocks at Sacsayhuamán they left exactly where they stood. The colonizers who melted Inca gold without a second thought took one look at the biggest stones and decided it was easier to build around them. Sacsayhuamán pushes single block weight past 100 tons, but for sheer accumulated tonnage and for one unfinished object that exposes the limit more honestly than any temple, we go to Egypt. Number 2. The Great Pyramid and the Unfinished Obelisk. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2,560 years before the Common Era, and the numbers have not lost their power to flatten you. Roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, about 5.5 million tons of limestone, and, set deep inside it, around 8,000 tons of granite hauled from Aswan, some 800 kilometers up the Nile. The granite beams roofing the king's chamber and the relieving chambers stacked above it weigh as much as 60 to 80 tons each. And they were not merely moved that distance. They were lifted some 70 meters into the air and set in place with no iron, no steel, and no machine more complex than the lever, the rope, and the ramp. The whole structure was then leveled across its more than 200-meter base to within a few centimeters, and aligned to true north to within a small fraction of a single degree. Accuracy that would be respectable with modern instruments. When it was finished, the pyramid did not look the way it does now. It was sheathed in casing stones of polished white limestone from Tura, so smooth and bright that it would have blazed in the desert sun like a single carved jewel. Most of that casing was stripped away over the centuries to build medieval Cairo. Even stripped, the Great Pyramid remained the tallest structure ever raised by human beings for nearly 4,000 years, a record unbroken until the spires of the European cathedrals. The mainstream picture of how is more solid than most people assume, and it deserves to be presented seriously because it is genuinely clever.
Blocks rode on wooden sledges dragged over sand, and the Egyptians wet the sand ahead of the sledge to cut the friction. That is not speculation. A wall painting in the tomb of a nobleman named Jehuti-Hotep shows a man standing on the front of a giant sledge, pouring water onto the ground before it. And in 2014, the physicist Daniel Bohn and his colleagues at the University of Amsterdam, publishing in Physical Review Letters, demonstrated that wetting sand to the right degree roughly halves the force needed to pull a heavy load across it. The Egyptians were doing applied physics with a water jar. We even have a logbook. In 2013, at a Red Sea site called Wadi al-Jarf, the archaeologist Pierre Tallet found the papyrus diary of an inspector named Merer, written during the reign of Khufu, the oldest inscribed papyrus yet found in Egypt. In it, Merer records his crew ferrying white limestone by boat from the Tura quarries to the Giza Pyramid, voyage after voyage. And in 2024, a team led by Iman Ghonaim at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, publishing in Communications, Earth and Environment, mapped a long-buried branch of the Nile, they named it the Aramat Branch, that once ran right along the foot of the pyramid plateau, giving the builders a water highway to float their stone almost to the door. The mystery of the pyramid was never total. Some of its workers left us their paperwork. But the object that says the most about the edge of Egyptian capability is not the pyramid at all.
It is a failure. In a granite quarry at Aswan lies the unfinished obelisk, a single shaft around 42 meters long that would have weighed somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 tons had it ever stood. It was being cut directly out of the bedrock, very likely on the orders of the pharaoh Hatshepsut, the workers pounding the granite free with balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite itself. And then a crack opened along its length. The flaw made the shaft worthless, and they abandoned it where it lay, still attached to the mother rock. We learned more from the obelisk the Egyptians could not finish than from the dozens they could. It records the method in the act of failing, the trenches, the pounding marks, the moment the rock betrayed the plan. One stone, 1,100 tons, that even Egypt had to walk away from once the granite split. 1,100 tons was Egypt's edge. It was not the edge of the ancient world. In a valley in Lebanon, 3 stones were not only cut larger, they were lifted and set into a wall 7 meters above the ground. Number 1. Baalbek. Picture yourself in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, standing at the base of the temple complex the Romans called Heliopolis. In front of you is a wall, part of the podium beneath the temple of Jupiter. 3 stones run along it, end to end, each one longer than a city bus, each weighing roughly 800 tons. They do not rest on the ground. They sit 7 meters up, on a course of smaller blocks, set so closely that the seams between them barely take the edge of a coin. This is the Trilithon, the 3 stones, and they are, by a wide margin, among the largest building blocks ever lifted and placed by human beings.
The Romans built the temple across the 1st century before and the 1st century of the Common Era, raising over it a colonnade of columns around 20 meters tall, among the largest ever erected in the classical world, as a deliberate statement of imperial scale on the eastern frontier. For a long time, the Trilithon was the upper limit of what we knew they had moved. Then, the quarry told us the rest. About 900 meters from the temple lies a block the locals call the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, still half attached to the bedrock, weighing an estimated 1,000 tons. And in the summer of 2014, an excavation by the German Archaeological Institute uncovered a 3rd block beneath it, nearly 20 meters long, 6 meters wide, more than 5 meters thick, with an estimated weight of around 1,650 tons. It is the single largest worked stone known anywhere in the ancient world.
The cutters left it in the quarry because a flaw appeared in one edge, and a flawed stone of that size was not worth a journey it would never survive. Now hold the 2 facts together. The Romans cut a stone of 1,600 tons, and they lifted 800-ton blocks 7 meters into the air and seated them with the precision of joinery. The mainstream explanation is sober and human. The quarry sits slightly higher than the temple, so no lifting was needed to move the blocks horizontally. They could be levered onto rollers and eased down packed earth embankments using capstans, the hand-cranked winches the Romans used everywhere. For the horizontal journey, that works. For the vertical lift onto the podium, the honesty has to be sharper. The largest cranes documented in the Roman world could raise perhaps a few tens of tons. 800 tons is more than an order of magnitude beyond that. No surviving Roman text describes how it was done. The standard answer, many capstans, many levers, vast embankments of earth, and a great deal of time, is plausible. It has simply never been demonstrated at that mass. This is the place where people reach for the fantasy that someone other than humans must have done it, and it is exactly the place to refuse. Everything at Baalbek is human and Roman. The quarry is there. The tool marks are there. The half-cut block with its Roman-era flaw is there. The question was never who. It was never when. It was and remains how, in detail, step by step, on the afternoon the stone went up. And across the same handful of centuries, on the other side of the planet, that same question was being answered in parallel. Laborers fitting 200-ton blocks above Cusco, islanders floating basalt onto a Pacific reef, Egyptians wetting sand before a sledge. Different stone, different rope, the same wall of physics, pushed in the same direction by people who had never heard of one another.
You are looking at Baalbek, at the upper bound of what people could do with rope, ramps, muscle, and a refusal to accept a smaller plan. And the unsettling part is not that the answer is missing. It is that we still cannot fully reconstruct the day they found it. Across all 10 of these sites, the same short list of tools keeps reappearing. The lever, the roller, the sledge, the ramp, wetted sand, floated stone, and above everything else, organized human labor measured in thousands of people and tens of years. There is no lost machine hiding in the record. What hides in the record is patience and coordination at a scale we no longer have the stomach for. The same physics worked over and over on 6 continents by people who could not have compared notes. And the frontier is still moving, recently and fast. In 2014, archaeologists confirmed a 1,600-ton block at Baalbek that no one had measured before.
That same year, physicists in Amsterdam quantified the wet sand trick the Egyptians had painted on a tomb wall 4,000 years earlier. In 2020, a geochemist traced Stonehenge's giant sarsens to a single wood in Wiltshire. In 2024, 2 separate teams traced the altar stone 700 kilometers to Scotland and mapped a buried branch of the Nile running past the pyramids. The understanding is not finished. It is being rewritten, paper by paper, with the builders still a step ahead of us. What the people behind these projects had in common is not genius in the modern sense. It is the willingness to begin something that would not be finished in a single lifetime, and the social glue to keep thousands of hands pulling in one direction long after the people who designed it were dead. The Maltese temple builders had that and then lost it. The Yangshan planners reached for it and admitted defeat. The rest left walls. So when we call these structures impossible, we should be honest about what the word means. It does not mean that something other than human beings raised them. It means we have reached the edge of what we can fully explain about human ingenuity, and at site after site, that edge turns out to stand much further out than the textbooks let on. The obelisk that cracked, the stele left in the mountain, the tired stones on the road to Ollantaytambo, those are the honest markers, the exact places where the builders finally hit the wall. The wall is real. It is just standing a great deal further away than we were ever taught. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.